Good evening. Welcome to University College and Durham Castle. My name is Wendy Powers, and it is my honor to serve this learning community as its principal. We're delighted to have each of you here with us this evening, whether in person or the 150 or so of you who are watching online. We are thrilled to reawaken the Castle Lectures program with you this evening. As you may know, this year, 2022, is the 950th birthday of our beloved college home. Upon orders from William the Conqueror, construction works on Durham Castle began in 1072 with the goal of providing a bastion of protection against the Scots. Since then, the castle has been expanded, destroyed, rebuilt, renovated, and reimagined to serve many different aims. Of course, the castle's physical evolution has reflected the many ways in which its purpose has changed over the centuries. From military fortress to Prince Bishop's Palace to regional university, and now the flagship college of this top 100 global university. It's no wonder our theme for this year-long birthday celebration is reawakening. Not only has the castle experienced many reawakenings in its 950-year history, but our communities today are literally and figuratively reawakening from this global pandemic. And it's truly a joy to welcome all of you here tonight, just our second public lecture in the last 3 years. So tonight, we reawaken the Castle Lectures and welcome to Durham Castle a renowned colleague, distinguished scholar, and new friend, Dr. Barbara Boehm, Curator Emerita of the Met Cloisters in New York. As you may have seen in the publicity for tonight's lecture, Barbara's decades-long career at the Metropolitan Museum is distinguished by creative exhibitions born of collaborative work with colleagues from Toronto to Prague and everywhere in between. A modest sampling of prize-winning exhibitions include Enamels of Limoges, Prayer Book for a Queen, The Hours of Jean Deveau, Prague, The Crown of Bohemia, and Small Wonders, Gothic boxwood miniatures. In 2016, Barbara co-curated Jerusalem, 1000 to 1400, Every People Under Heaven, the catalog of which garnered the Alfred H. Barr Jr. Award. From 2012 to 2015, Dr. Boehm served as Director of Curatorial Studies for the Met and NYU's Institute of Fine Arts, from which she earned her doctorate. An alumna of Wellesley College, Dr. Boehm also read history at the University of Aberdeen. She lectures widely, most recently for the Smithsonian Associates, the YIVU Institute for Jewish Research, and St. George's College, Jerusalem, where she leads a biennial course on the Holy Land and the arts. After meeting her this evening, you'll understand why Barbara has been recognized with numerous awards and distinctions from professional and civic partners around the world. Now for a few things you might not know about Barbara. Her mother's family is from nearby Hexham. She loves and has visited Durham on numerous occasions, and she's a genuinely warm and wonderful person to talk with and learn from. Barbara joins us tonight through her connection with our esteemed chaplain and Solway Fellow, Reverend Dr. Stephanie Burette, who met Barbara in Jerusalem while serving at St. George's College. We're so grateful to Stephanie for sharing her colleague and her friend with us this evening. And I'm equally grateful to Dr. Ellen Crabtree, Julia Bonner, Dan Thompson, Jamie Short, Sam Kirkman, Catherine Bertram, Aditya Madden, and many others for helping us to ensure a robust and successful Castle Lectures reawakening. Dr. Boehm's presentation this evening will run for about an hour, and we'll welcome questions from both here on site, this audience, as well as the audience online. Afterwards, we'll welcome those of us here in the Great Hall to enjoy some refreshments in the back of the room for continued conversation. Now, sit back and enjoy A Beckoning World Art and Trade in the Time of Bishop Beck with Dr. Barbara Boehm.
Good evening, and I can't thank this university enough for the incredibly warm welcome I've received over the course of nearly a week now. I thought I was going to be quarantined for a long time, but the government changed the rules and I've been free to wander about Durham. I have to tell you, I've been a bit intimidated about that possibility. When I was a little girl, I was here with my mother, and a very proper English lady told me that I was making too much noise inside Durham Cathedral. Apparently, though, there was no official report was filed, or the report's been lost, so I was not stopped upon my arrival. It does seem a bit audacious, though, doesn't it? I mean, my coming here from New York to this room in particular to speak about Anthony Beck, the man who had this room built. He is, after all, already a prominent figure in the history of Durham Cathedral and Durham Castle. Born about 1245, he studied at Oxford from 1267 to 70. I'm sure this audience will forgive him that. Along with his brother, he was among the earliest students at Merton College, where he was taken under wing, in a sense, by Walter de Merton. He was elected Bishop of Durham in 1283. He was the nominal Patriarch of Jerusalem from 1306. And he's buried in the Chapel of the Nine Altars here at Durham Cathedral. He's a classic, powerful bishop of Durham. So what more could there be to say? He minted coin, as medieval bishops often did. And there are more than 90 of them in the British Museum, of which you see two examples on the screen at the moment. As a patron, he commissioned manuscripts, including commentary on Thomas Aquinas, which is here in Durham, and he commissioned a great Bible with his arms just a little bit below those of the king, which is preserved in Paris today in the Bibliothèque Mazarine, and I hope you can see the detail at the bottom. This is a delicious decoration on it, a lion and deer, an exquisite layout, really beautifully presented classic Gothic manuscript. He was concerned with matters of law, as we see in a manuscript preserved in the library at Princeton. This manuscript comprises of several things. My personal favorite is that it has a charter of the forest. He was quite a hunter himself, so rules and regulations about how to hunt and who can hunt and where were important to him. It also includes the statutes of Magna Carta as reaffirmed by Edward I in 1300, and his name is on the reissue of Magna Carta. Here in Durham, his seals are preserved in the cathedral archives. I'm showing you both the seal of Beck as bishop on the left and as nominal Patriarch of Jerusalem on the right. Other collections have his seal as well, including the National Archives, the National Museum of Wales, and the Scoian collection, which you see here. Most material evidence of his legacy was scattered at his death and subsequently, yet the name of Bishop Beck is ever present in Northeast England. Witness the exciting recent discovery of the ruins of his grand chapel at Auckland Castle, which was brutally demolished in the 1650s in the wake of the English Civil War. His name can be invoked at Eltham Castle, where he died, and not to mention how his name must reverberate perhaps negatively, surely negatively, in Scotland. What is generally mentioned, but briefly, in passing, in any account of Beck's biography, is his participation in the crusade led by the future Edward I in 1270. And I'm actually showing you the tomb of William of Valence in Westminster Abbey, who was also part of that same crusade. So in this evening's lecture, I want to put that chapter back into the story of Anthony Beck of Durham because it speaks to the wider world of which he was aware, that he engaged with, a wider world of which we may even perhaps have less awareness than he. Now, this isn't so easy to do. First of all, there's a general lack of attention to this particular crusade. It's not even always known by the same name. It's designated sometimes as part of the Eighth Crusade, sometimes it's called the Ninth, sometimes it's known as Lord Edward's Crusade. This campaign without a clear name lacks the apocalyptic drama, the blood and guts, and the vaunted success of the First Crusade, the celebrities of the Third, the dazzling booty and the greedy shame of the Fourth. And from where we sit, this is but the last gasp of an enterprise for which we have little understanding and less sympathy. It is not consistent with our values today, our understanding of Christianity. We have, moreover, no diary, no letters, no physical trace left by Beck from his travels. But we know Edward's itinerary, and we can draw on contemporary descriptions and images of the places that Beck went ashore. This was a beckoning wide world. And we will see that by focusing on two cities on the Crusaders' journey. Tunis on the African Mediterranean coast, and Acre, or Akko, in present-day Israel. Anthony Beck's adventures begin after protracted effort to gain traction for this crusade in England. And the path forward was ultimately smoothed by funding from Louis IX. And here we see Louis IX setting out from Aigues-Mortes, his port in the south of France, as Louis did twice. The English Crusaders, led by Prince Edward, journeyed from London to Dover, then through France on land, following the route of that Louis had taken in 1248 and 1270, and like Louis, they sailed from Aigues-Mortes. Louis and his allies didn't sail off to the Holy Land. Rather, they sailed straight to Tunis. Well, to Tunisia, landing in Carthage, 16 kilometers from the city of Tunis. Why did they do that? This is something that historians are still debating, and there may be multiple reasons. In Louis's case, it actually may have been because he had this idea, or he heard rumors that perhaps the ruler in Tunis could be interested in converting to Christianity. So Louis was well ahead of them, the English, and the timing of the English having been thrown off rather predictably, perhaps by the weather. So here we see Louis in a 1518 celebration of his effort. And you can see that he's landed on foreign shores. Just have a look. You see some of those boats are piloted by men who are black men. And Louis isn't riding a horse. He's riding a unicorn, as one does if one can. However, soon after his arrival, sickness befell the French, and Louis himself died. Here we see the death of Louis as it's represented in the Hours of Jean d'Evreux, one of the great masterpieces of the Cloisters collection, created several generations later by one of his descendants. This image focusing on the spiritual aspect of Louis' passing. He died on the 25th of August. That is, in fact, Saint Louis' feast day. You see there's a kind of sense of peacefulness, mourning on the part of the people around him. And you see that there are angels lifting up this little tiny person, which represents the soul of Saint Louis headed to heaven. And according to the legend, his own last words were an invocation of the city of Jerusalem. Meanwhile, chaos was swirling outside the tent. There were ambassadors who had come to see Louis. Louis's own son had died a couple of weeks earlier, that Jean Tristan. And we see here in this image the sense of the kind of really the perils and confusion that attended the death of the king. And you see that there's a large body of water that is standing between those troops and the citadel represented on the far side. Well, if I show you a map of Tunis, do you see that there is this very large lake? That lake, if you've been to Tunisia, you pass it on the way from the airport. It's quite astounding. Well, that was the way that the Hafsid troops were able to get supplies from the city itself, and it became a real focus of the skirmishes, because there were skirmishes between the Crusaders before a full onslaught attack, right? This is a view of that today. Do you see? It's really quite a remarkable feature of the landscape. So this image really gives us a sense of the consequences for the military campaign. With Louis dying, the crusade was put under the direction of his brother, Charles of Anjou, King of Sicily. These troops were poised, they were amped up and ready to go. And Charles really just wanted to cut a deal. So what was at stake then for the Hafsid ruler? So he had been in power since 1249. This crusade, therefore, was only 2 decades into his reign. He's about 40 years old. He was the second of the Hafsid rulers and the first to call himself to assume the name of Khalif. Initially, in his reign, he had to shore up his own position. His brother, he exiled to Spain. His uncle and his cousin, he executed for plotting against him. So now we've got the Crusaders arriving, and once again, his throne and the seat of his power is being threatened. Moreover, there was, of course, a huge risk to his capital and the cities of his reign. I want to give you just a sense of the wealth of the city of Tunis at this time. First, by looking at the Al Zaytun Mosque. This is the vast and imposing mosque, which is in the middle of the city. And again, only 16 kilometers from where the Crusaders are ensconced. The mosque was built on the foundations of a church, and it incorporates ancient material from Carthage, a profusion of marble columns and capitals. And interestingly, there's an inscription in the base of the dome of the mihrab that says a certain Fathallah, a slave of the Abbasid Khalif al-Nasir, had directed the works for the building campaign in the 9th century CE. This is another view that shows you this colonnade, this wonderful metered placement of these exquisite columns with the very elegant capitals. This kind of regularity of the sort of procession of the columns is quite a remarkable and beautiful aspect of this mosque. And then inside, you get this lacy effect, this jewel-like surround that enriches the inside. So, and that part is 13th century and later. So it's really from the time that we're speaking of this evening. There were 12 doors, there still are, 12 doors that provide access from the mosque out into the souk. And the souks that are closest to the mosque are the places where the most precious tradesmen and merchants are located. So for example, the goldsmiths, the perfume market, which you see on the right-hand side, that perfume market existing since the 13th century in proximity to the mosque. And this is where you go for amber, for incense, for the costly spices and so on. And so there's this easy flow from the secular to the sacred and back again, in and out of the mosque and in and out of the market. Not far outside Tunis is the city of Bizerte. It was the site of Al-Mustansir's palace. It's a charming village with really exquisite beaches today, but we have to use our mind's eye to conjure up what it was in the 13th century. Al-Mustansir had both palace and pleasure gardens here, built in the 1252. And we learn about it from a 14th century historian, Ibn Khaldun. He devotes an entire chapter to describing it and calls it a magnificent park unmatched anywhere in the world. Now, you all know, you have to be careful of the kind of flattering exaggeration that historians sometimes will give in order to curry favor. You have to take it with a grain of salt. But still, when you listen to the details and the specificity of what he's saying, you begin to understand how spectacular this place was. So he speaks of the Caliph riding in on his horse, accompanied by falconers, accompanied by hunting dogs, a particular kind of hunting dog because he was quite an expert at hunting. And those were called salukis for those of you who are dog mad. And leopards. Leopards. How odd is that? It's not. In fact, if you look at Western European medieval tapestries of around 1500 anyway, you see sometimes leopards with collars on. They managed to tame them enough, I don't know exactly how, I suppose by being very well fed, that they were actually able to train them to help in the hunt. Now, the ladies of the harem could enter the park without being seen, thanks to high walls that the Caliph built along the path that ran from the palace and to the park. And then he built a pavilion facing west, so facing the setting sun, with a big portal, double door portal, which our historian tells us was artistically worked in wood. And so heavy, this door, that it took a number of men to open and close them. Inside those doors was a stairway, 50 steps going up, as wide as the door, so that when on state occasions, the Caliph would appear enthroned at the top of the steps against this great open portal. So in terms of pomp and circumstance, absolutely what you would want, right? Al-Mustansir also had a garden at Abu Feher, not far from the airport today in Tunis. Doesn't survive. There were forests of trees that formed trellises. And the trees are named by Ibn Khaldun: figs, olives, pomegranates, dates, and other fruit trees. You can almost sense the juiciness of them, right? As well as things that they called wild trees, the tamarisk and the jujube. Now, I don't know if you know here in England what a jujube is. In the States, it's a really terrible candy that they sell at movie theaters. It sticks in your teeth, but it's supposed to, in the original form, be used to ease a cough or a sore throat. So very good thing to know about in our pandemic era, perhaps, I don't know. There were manicured gardens, ponds, and green fields that our historian tells us charmed the onlookers. So he mentions how things looked, what was beautiful, what was well worked, and he uses poetry to try to evoke the beauty of the place. Lemon and orange trees are entwined their branches with those of the cypress, while myrtle and jasmine smiled at the water lily. Now, at either end of the pavilion, there was a pavilion at either end, one larger, one smaller, covered in mosaic and with marble columns. And the floors, again, are of wood, admirably worked, and he notes the arabesque patterns that were used in the floor. The garden itself surrounded a body of water so big that it seemed like a sea. And that water came in by means of the ancient Roman aqueduct. So Al-Mustansir restores the aqueduct from the source at Zalwain all the way to running to Carthage. So just 3 years before the Crusaders arrived, he had finished this work. And he has the control of the water so that it streams in very briskly. And our historian tells us that the women love to play in the water in little floaty boats. But let's not slip into a tempting Western stereotype understanding of the role of women in this society. For during Al-Mustansir's reign, there lived a most remarkable woman who was a Sufi scholar, Aisha al-Manubiya. She was a student of Sidi Bou Said. Now, anyone who's been to Tunis might know that as a place name. It is a place name today. It's the place where this particular Sufi scholar studied, and she was his student. And she was known for her charity and her boldness and had quite a reputation down to the present day. This is her shrine, photographed fairly recently, but which tragically was destroyed in 2012 by religious extremists. So it's clear that Al-Mustansir had plenty of incentive to avoid war with the Crusaders. He's got a good thing going. He's got a very solid reign. What accounts for all the wealth that he has? I think if you just look at the map, it becomes perfectly obvious. It was perfectly obvious to the Romans. It's been perfectly obvious throughout history. The situation of Tunisia sticking out there from the rest of the African continent right into the Mediterranean is really what makes it very noticeable, right? And this is not just a medieval notion, right? Remember that the British were the ones who convinced the Americans that if they were going to win the Second World War, they had to start in North Africa. Not to mention the fact that the Americans weren't battle ready, but they had to first break the control of trade in the Mediterranean, control of the seas in the Mediterranean in that case, right? And this was a notion that was very prominent in the medieval period as well. And we can see that in this manuscript. This is a manuscript that's in the Vatican collection, and the manuscript was written by a tradesman who was pressing for a new crusade. This was in the 14th century. How do you break the power of the Muslim rule? And the way to do it would have been by a blockade to break their control of the Mediterranean. And you see that this is all about essential trade in goods, right? Olive oil and human beings. The reason for the recommendation was that what we see here, we see European imports headed for the North African port, wood, iron, a barrel of pitch. Do you see that in the detail on the left-hand side, but the right-hand image, along with Christian slaves. And what was coming out of North Africa? Gold, ivory, Muslim slaves. Tunis was the endpoint of the gold trade from sub-Saharan Africa that went up through Kairouan to Tunis and thence to the Mediterranean. And Al-Mustansir had diplomatic ties with the Kanem-Bornu Empire, which comprises present-day Niger, Cameroon, Chad, and Nigeria. And according to Ibn Khaldun, he even received a giraffe from the ruler of Kanem in 1275. You know how they always sent these crazy exotic animals as diplomatic gifts. The importance of Arab gold is seen, oddly enough, in a 13th century Sicilian poem. So in the 13th century, there were imperial mints in Sicily, right? And in this poem, a guy is trying to seduce a woman and she wants nothing to do with him. And he's trying all the lines he can think of. And he does mention he's pretty rich and he has a lot of gold coins. And he specifically mentions the Sicilian minted coins, right? And her response is, I am a woman who is worth Arab gold. The carats were higher in Arab gold. The Sicilian gold coins were alloyed. So, you know, today one might speak of sterling character. Well, in this story, they're speaking of 24-carat character, right? Tunis was the main North African port for Genoese merchants beginning in 1220. And gold was what Charles of Anjou was after. In the words of the Bishop of Agrigento, he who was thirsty drank from Arab gold. So Charles cuts a deal. 210,000 gold ounces. That was more than double the annual income of the French crown. He had blockaded Tunis for 4 months. There were heavy losses on both sides, and the Khalif was ready to settle. But it should be said that the provisions for the free exercise of religion were part of the Treaty of Tunis, which was finalized in October of 1270. And I'm quoting in translation, the monks of the Christians or their priests may live, stay in the land of the emir of the believers, and he gives them a place where they can build their residences and houses of prayer and places for burying their dead. The said monks and the priests may preach and pray in a loud voice in their churches, and they may serve God according to what is accustomed in their practice and what they are used to in their countries. Okay, so meanwhile, what of the English? They were late to the party. They arrived just 5 days before Louis died. The Treaty of Tunis was finalized on October 30. Al-Mustansir swore to it on November 5th, and the English get there on the 10th, just as the French are packing up. So the English are bound to the terms of the treaty, but guess what? They don't benefit from it, not one bit of that gold. Everyone then goes to Sicily. And on the way, there's a disastrous storm. There are more than 4,000 soldiers lost, 18 ships, et cetera, et cetera. And Charles says, you know what? I've had enough. This is a done deal. I'm just going to stay home now. Edward and his entourage with Anthony Beck, having come this far and not having benefited either monetarily or spiritually, winters at Trapani and then decides to press on with an army of about 1,000. This gamelion, which is a hand washing basin, it's for washing your hands at the table, casts the notion of crusading in terms of the glories of battle. War games like a ballet. Do you see how sort of elegant the fighting looks? This is this kind of balance this between the romance of the notion of going to the Holy Land and the perils of the journey. But I want to give you a sense about the perils of that journey by reading to you from the words of Jacques de Vitry. He was elected Bishop of Acre in 1214. So he's a generation before Edward and Beck's adventures, but he provides a reality check in describing the storm that was encountered en route to Acre. Now, along with a grain of salt, Jacques de Vitry was elected Bishop of Acre in 1214, but he hung around in Rome for a while because he was really looking for a better position. And when it became clear that he wasn't going to get a fancier position, he purchased a ship and stocked it with provisions. But we can sense that he set out with some ambivalent feelings about going to the Holy Land. But he describes the journey as follows. The forepart of our ship was now lifted up towards the stars, and the next moment it was sunk into the depths. The storm lasted continuously for 2 days and nights, so that some of our people could hardly bear the violence of the wind, which laid low the forecastle of our ship and broke down in panic, while others did not eat or drink for the fear of death. Not exactly a TripAdvisor rating. Acre by this time was the Crusaders' last stronghold in the Holy Land, clinging to the edges of the land. Edward and his entourage arrive in Acre in May of 1271, and they don't get off to a great start. Montfort Castle in the month of June is captured by Sultan Baybars. Edward and his knights are unable to stop that, and the survivors withdraw to Acre. Montfort Castle was excavated by the Metropolitan Museum in the 1920s. The archaeological finds include some moderately interesting sculpture like you see on the left, and then a big wrecking ball kind of thing on the right. A little bit of a delicately painted nose of stained glass and a very modest lamp with Islamic inscriptions. Edward and his entourage attempted to capture Castle at Hakoun in December. This was an unsuccessful effort to regain a town that had been taken previously by Sultan Baybars. It had a church that had been turned into a mosque and a caravanserai for merchants and travelers. Not very a place of great consequence at the time. Today, it remains just as a depopulated Palestinian village, which may or may not one day turn into an Israeli national park. A truce was agreed upon in April of 1272, and the good news was that it would allow Christian access to Jerusalem again. But the Pope said, no, that really mustn't go right now. It may be that Edward and the Queen and some of their principals, presumably including Anthony Beck, then visited Nazareth. But it was a temporary possession of Nazareth. The Church of the Virgin had been destroyed. Its great glories, of which you see here on the screen, these wonderful capitals, were not known to them because they had been buried and hidden. But what of Acre itself? Our view is the 13th century view of Matthew Paris of St. Albans. Matthew Paris entered St. Albans in 1217. He was close to Henry III, but he's an armchair traveler. And as he describes the trip to the Holy Land, the errors do creep in after Paris, but still we don't actually really understand how his information is quite as good as it is. The large size that he gives Acre is a reflection of its key rule, key role for European at this time. Our friend Jacques de Vitry continued to be a bit grumpy after he arrived in Acre, saying, "I found the town of Acre like a monster or a beast having 9 heads, each fighting the other." Well, why would he say that? Well, Acre had big city issues. A historian, contemporary of ours, Adrian Boas, on the subject of Acre, thinking about what it was like ecologically in the Middle Ages, said most of the city's refuse excrement no doubt ended up in the port. The slaughterhouse, the butcher's stalls, the fisher's cellars were located there, and they added to the waste that flowed from the city's sewers into the harbor, including the sewage carried by the remarkable system of vaulted channels draining the latrine tower of the hospitals. Again, not the TripAdvisor rating that you might be hoping for. Greater concern, however, than this ecological nightmare was voiced by Pope Innocent IV, who in 1246 had written to the patriarch and bishops of the kingdom concerning certain, and I quote, Genoese, Pisan, and Venetian merchants who take Greeks, Bulgars, Russians, and Vlachs, all Christians, both male and female, from the regions of Constantinople, and travel to the kingdom of Jerusalem, where they sell them to the highest bidder, even Saracens, in such a way that many of those sold are held as slaves. Oh, talking about human trafficking in the city of Acre. But Jacques de Vitry, who'd been so grumpy at the time of his arrival, eventually adopts a more upbeat tone, saying that churches are being repaired, monasteries are being constructed, there are ministers, and there's the divine worship. And he's feeling pretty good about how things are going. So you have a sense of a tale of two cities here, with both the raw edges and the refined. Acre's beauty is constantly mentioned, especially in terms of the towers and the beautiful stone, the streets being neat, all the walls of the houses the same height, wondrously adorned with glass windows and paintings. So this, again, appeal to beauty. The streets of the city covered with silken cloths. This is a kind of colorfulness that we cannot get from the maps and plans. And because the city's churches were destroyed in the aftermath of its loss in 1291, so just 20 years after Edward was there, this challenge is really, it is a challenge to convey the liveliness and richness of that city. This is an image of the ruins of one of the Crusader churches. There were 71 churches that have been documented in 15th century Acre. 71 churches, beginning with the Cathedral of the Holy Cross and including foundations for the Benedictines, the Dominicans, the Franciscans. You get the idea. Significant buildings. The towers of the Templars had life-size gilded lions. And they set up sort of substitute pilgrimages there. Since they couldn't get to Jerusalem, they went round. They had a kind of green Michelin guide for pilgrimage around Acre itself. We have a hint, the vaguest hints of the presence of the churchmen that we get through broken slabs like this, which is an Archbishop of Nazareth who was elected in the 1280s. So again, just after Edward and Beck were there. A capital surviving from St. John's. You have just a sense of elegance to the thing, but nothing to really convey to you the omnipresence of these churches. The city's selection of relics included a copper cross, nothing surprising there, but also a bathtub for the baby Jesus, which apparently piques not only my curiosity, but the curiosity of the Pope, who ordered that it be investigated in 1311. There were relics going out of Acre and relics coming into Acre from the west. And if you want to get a sense of the beauty of the churches, you actually have to go to Cairo, where one of the doorways from the church was taken up in whole and moved and installed by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars into this great doorway of a madrasa in Cairo. Look at the amazing slender columns and the dainty capitals and the lovely trefoil arch. And what about the residents? It is said that they walked about the streets in a royal state with golden coronets on their heads, each of them like a king with his knights, his followers, his mercenaries, his retainers. his clothing and his war horse, wondrously bedecked with gold and silver, all vying with one another. Sound like a prince bishop? There were Christians of all stripes there in Acre, and this was always surprising to the European. The different things that they did, they could be distinguished by the way that they crossed themselves, by the way that they wore their beards. And Jacques de Vitry goes on at length. Can you see the censer being swung there in this procession of Christians on this from the time of Islamic metalwork, but showing Christian procession. Jacques de Vitry's own episcopal garb and liturgical objects survive today in Namur. His ivory crosier, having been a key port for the export of ivory. Ivory box, one of them containing the label saying that it contained the oil of Sinai. Sinai was a holy site in Syria dedicated to the Virgin that down to the modern era draws both Christian and Muslim women. So Jacques de Vitry must have brought that box back from his time in Holy Land. A ring of sapphire, which poetically links the stone sapphire to the Holy Land. And his cross with Byzantine enamels reused. Now, how do I know that? When you look at the inscriptions on the enamels, they don't go together in a program. They go together by the color of their hair and beards. So clearly the goldsmith who put it together, the Western goldsmith who put it together, went with an alignment, an aesthetic alignment, rather than any kind of theological links between them. So once Jacques de Vitry got home, he consecrated 5 new altars, and he adorned them with things that he had sent back from the East. So then what about Anthony Beck, our future Bishop of Durham? Now, granted, he's not a priest yet, but consider for a moment this knight of the Dallouis family. This is an effigy in the Cloisters collection, a wonderful French knight, that effigy made somewhere between 1248 and 67. It shows us that there was access to the markets. Why? Because that sword that he's carrying has nothing to do with a crusader sword. That is a sword that is typical of Chinese use at the time. So did this knight acquire that from a fallen enemy, or did he acquire it in the market in the Holy Land? We don't know, but we know that there's plenty of access to the foreign and the exotic in Acre. In fact, Edward and Anthony Beck's stay in Acre overlapped with Marco Polo's second visit to the city in 1271. Acre was called the rendezvous of Muslim and Christian merchants from the 4 quarters of the world by Ibn Jabir, a celebrated 12th century traveler. There were merchants from North Africa, Damascus, Yemen, Baghdad, and Mosul. And a description from a German traveler said that also dwelt in Acre the richest merchants under heaven, who were gathered there together out of all nations. There were Pisans, Genoese, and Lombards. Everything that can be found in the world that is wondrous or strange used to be brought there because of the nobles and princes who dwelt there. We can see it in secular objects, not only in Jacques de Vitry's possession. This is a belt that belongs to the Cloisters, and it reminded me of another famous tale, this from Boccaccio. He tells a story about a medieval business dinner in Paris at which various merchants are gathered, and one of them is from Genoa, and that guy from Genoa has a very, very virtuous wife. But that virtuous wife was robbed from her home, and they stole her silver belt. And the silver belt was first taken by the thieves to Cairo, and then eventually it ended up in Acre. So the whole story is about how precious objects were moved all around the Mediterranean by merchants. And if you look at the decoration on this, which I'm not sure you can see in this light, so you just have to come to New York and see it at the Cloisters. There's a wonderful, typically European decoration, and then you get these moments where you have this guy at the bottom looking very sort of Persian, holding a falcon. There's a mix of the imagery that suggests this east-west contact. Well, Things had seemed to be going well, but the city of Acre proved a dangerous place for the intrepid Edward. Sultan Baybar sent a hitman to assassinate Edward, and he was in fact gravely wounded, such that he needed surgery and it was dicey. So Anthony Beck was one of 8 signatories to the will that Edward drew up in order to save his life. In case he lost his life, as was William of Valence, whom we saw before. So Edward and his company head home in September of 1272 on a rather protracted trip via Sicily. They stop off on the Italian mainland to see the new pope, recently consecrated as Gregory X, who had been with them in Acre when he was Theobald Visconti. And here you see that same pope with members of the Polo family. So did our Anthony Beck take anything home with him? Had he been to the market? I mean, after all, we know that Queen Eleanor commissioned an illuminated manuscript for her husband while they were in Acre, a new translation of a manuscript of a classical manuscript about the art of war. And records show that she made purchases from a Syrian merchant there known as Roger of Acre. She bought jewels, she bought Venetian glass, so she was buying European products there, but she was also buying metalwork from Damascus, 2 basins, amber, silks, and camel hair from Tripoli. We know of the gift to Westminster Abbey of a cross with gold foot and emeralds brought back from Palestine by William of Valence from that very same crusade. The gift came to them later, but he had brought it home from that same crusade. But we search in vain for that kind of precision about the source of the gems in the documentation about Anthony Beck. We know he had a gemmed mitre. Where did he get the gems? We don't know. No camel hair, no Damascus metalwork, no Chinese sword. There's a sense of unfinished business when it comes to Edward Anthony Beck and the Holy Land. Edward left behind a paid garrison. He built a tower in the city walls at Acre, which he retained until 1278 and passed it off to the Order of St. Edward. Pope Gregory X, who had known, right, this Teobaldo Visconti, who had known Beck and Acre, had written to him and said, "Truly, you are one who has observed the needs of that land. You've observed the needs of that land with your very own eyes, and on account of that, you ought to support it." And in the 1290s, Beck had arranged for indulgences for those planning to go on crusade or funding a substitute. At some point before June of 1305, Beck, along with some other clerks, had vowed to take the cross in response to a plea from Pope Clement, some 30 years after the crusade of Lord Edward. And in May 1306, he took part in that's the same year that he was named Patriarch of Jerusalem. He took part in a ceremonial knighting of Prince Edward, who reaffirmed his own intentions to go on crusade again. At his death in 1311, Bishop Beck left 1,000 marks for the Holy Land. His seal, after being made patriarch, I wish you could see it better. I wish you could see the original, is quite remarkable. Remember that the matrix, or such a fine seal impression, is done by an accomplished goldsmith work, and rather exceptionally for Anthony Beck. Let's just look for a second. Do you see how large he is on his seal at the left? And do you see that on the right, he is now the little supplicant figure kneeling at the bottom? And what's large? What's largest is the crucifixion and the holy women at the tomb. Here and there in the documentation about Anthony Beck, we get provocative hints of the aesthetics of and the evocation of Outremer, at least at first glance. So after he was enthroned as Bishop of Durham, he presented 2 pieces of rich embroidery on stuff of gold called baudekins. But baudekins are variously understood as something is actually made in Baghdad or something blended with cotton that was produced in Venice. And in the case of Beck's baudekins, if we read a little farther, we see that they had representations of the Nativity, so clearly not of Eastern manufacture. Switching now to his bequest to Durham, the second of the vestments listed. Now they tend to list things in order of importance, right? So the second one says that it's a red Tartar cloth, a type of prized Mongol silk enhanced with gold. Aha! But these are well known in church inventories from the time, from St. Paul's to Prague to the Vatican. There are more than 100 listed in the Vatican inventories of the 13th and 14th century. The example on the screen is a piece of panno tartarico, that's what it's called in Latin, cut from a vestment of Pope Boniface VIII. So therefore, the mention of these in any possession of Beck is really more an indication of his taste being current. He's being a la mode rather than a true link to somewhere farther east where he might have, where he traveled. And furthermore, Tartarico had gilded archangels. So again, it's getting us anywhere. Interestingly enough, that when this particular piece is described in Beck's inventory, it goes on to say that he gave a piece of it to an English guy who was going to fight the king in Scotland. It was lost in the fighting, and how, you wonder how it was retrieved. But the point is that there was a story attached to that piece, but the story didn't have anything, disappointingly for me, to do with his travels. The sixth vestment finally is a Saracen, an Islamic silk. This is truly one, which curiously he wore specifically on the feast of St. Lawrence. So there is one indication that he had a taste for Islamic silk. He gave to the Church of Durham pictures representing the history of the Nativity. We don't know what they were like, but he does say that it has two scenes, so you think, is it maybe a diptych, like this Acre Crusader painting that's in Chicago, and I feel like I'm grasping at straws, right? All we have at the best is a sense that he was drawn to the ostentatious, the costly, and the refined. Some of the pieces that he had were absolutely classic, right? In the description, silver, gilded silver censer, and navette. Aha, sort of like the ones that are preserved in the V&A today that come from Ramsey Abbey of the mid-14th century. And one interesting robe of red velvet with an image of the coronation of the Virgin on the back, very possibly one of the earliest references in England to the use of velvet, and reminding me of a piece in the Met's collection, which actually comes from an old Yorkshire collection. At the time of his death, Beck's personal effects were valued at 6,000 marks. Edward II reserved the horses for himself and later bought up his gold plate from his executors. But guess what? No list of what they were. His successors his successor and bishop was a little bit worried because the things that he needed from his chapel that he expects to receive as the new bishop haven't shown up yet. And the list is very typical, right? Again, a censer, the incense boat, a pitcher for holy water, vestments, nothing more detailed. And this is where the trail ends. So then, did that faraway kingdom, these faraway kingdoms of this world, have an impact that we can see on Anthony Beck as he flew across them? The future bishop was about 25 when he sailed, about 40 when he became bishop, about 60 when he was named Patriarch of Jerusalem. Did it signify for him that travel, that honorific association with the Holy Land at the end of his days? Was it just about the prestige and the power? As an art historian, I am frustrated that Bishop Beck's few recorded possessions do not offer me a window on his travels, let alone to his heart and his soul. Objects have stories to tell. They talk to us. And I confess, I wanted to find a Jacques de Vitry or a William of Valence in Anthony Beck, bringing back relics, bringing back precious objects, rare gems. But instead, I'm left clinging to the threads of one Islamic silk among his vestments. And I'm tormented by the words from Gilbert and Sullivan's HMS Pinafore. For in spite of all temptation to belong to other nations, he remains an Englishman. I wanted a big reveal for you, an aha object. But perhaps the big reveal is that travel beyond our borders and encounters with others are far more subtle in effect than what we see in the marketplace or bring home as souvenirs. The impact should be written on our hearts, and it's up to us to be mindful of that. You students are not far in age from Anthony Beck's when he set out from Oxford for North Africa and the Holy Land. What will the wide world reveal to you when you set out from Durham? How will its impact play out in your lives? From where I sit, roughly Anthony Beck's age when he was named patriarch, that's the most important question. I thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to take any questions you might have.